Can you hear the sound of human bone cracking beneath the roar of the North Sea? This is not the sound of the battlefield, but the ritualized destruction of those who were once loved. Look into the eyes of Astrid, where a jarl's pride is being crushed under a shaming collar of rusted iron and thorns. You think you know the Vikings from their sagas of glory, but history has hidden the truth of the women erased in horrific silence. They were not granted the quick mercy of a blade. Instead, they were forced into brutal ceremonies that made the gods turn away in shame. You were told stories of the blood eagle for kings, but they never told you the names of the women subjected to the shadow eagle. Victims flayed alive and rubbed with salt just to serve as a monument of agony. Today, we dig up the truth that Hollywood and history books were too afraid to show. If you believe the world deserves to know the names of the forgotten, stay with us. The reality behind the 10 most cruel Roman and Viking punishments is about to be carved into history. The gray sky over the settlement of Kattegat hung low, heavy with the scent of salt and the impending bite of a winter storm that refused to break. A relentless, freezing drizzle turned the earth into a graveyard of black mud, clinging to the boots of the Norsemen as they gathered. The wind howled through the narrow gaps between the longhouses, carrying with it the rhythmic, metallic clanging of a blacksmith's hammer, a sound that today served as a funeral bell for a living soul. Astrid stood at the edge of the assembly, her breath hitching in the frigid air. Once the pride of her father's hall, she was a woman of sharp features and eyes the color of a stormy sea, now clouded with terror. Beside her stood her younger sister, Thyra, a girl barely 10 winters old with soft golden hair and trembling hands that clutched at Astrid's tunic for warmth. They were no longer the daughters of a jarl. They were the remnants of a traitor's house. The crowd parted as Jarl Bjorn approached. He was a man built like an oak, scarred by 100 raids, with a beard braided with silver rings that glinted coldly in the dim light. Behind him followed the law speaker, an elderly man draped in heavy furs, carrying the gragas, the ancient gray goose laws of the Viking people. In accordance with the sacred law, the law speaker's voice grated like stones grinding together. The sins of the father flow through the blood of the daughters. As Jarl Erik sought to sell our shores to the Franks, his lineage is stripped of honor. They are no longer kin. They are property. With a brutal jerk, Bjorn's guards stepped forward. They tore the fine raven feather cloaks from the women's shoulders, symbols of their status now trampled into the muck. The cold hit Astrid like a physical blow, but the shame felt colder. From a small brazier, the blacksmith pulled 2 iron collars. They were crude, heavy things, lined with inward-facing thorns of rusted metal. As the iron was forced around Astrid's neck and hammered shut, the thorns bit into her skin, a constant reminder that any sudden movement would draw her own blood. These were the shaming collars, the marks of a thrall who had no right to look a free man in the eye. "Down!" Bjorn commanded, his voice a low growl. Astrid hesitated, her dignity screaming in protest, until a guard's heavy boot struck the back of her knees. She fell into the freezing sludge. Thyra sobbed beside her, forced into the same humiliating posture. They were ordered to crawl through the center of the thing, the great assembly of the people. As Astrid dragged her body through the biting mud, the crowd erupted. These were the same people who had feasted in her father's hall. Most painful of all were the children, young boys like Ivar, a red-headed lad whose fever Astrid had once broken with herbal poultices. Now, Ivar's face was twisted in a mask of taut hatred. He picked up a jagged stone and hurled it. Clang. The stone struck the iron collar around Astrid's neck, sending a vibration through her jaw that tasted like copper and old grief. Another stone hit her shoulder, then another. The laughter of the village elders drowned out the whistling wind. Astrid kept her head down, her fingers digging into the filth, her heart hardening into a shard of ice. She wasn't just crawling through mud. She was crawling out of history, becoming a ghost before she had even stopped breathing. The iron collar had become a part of Astrid's very breathing. Every time she swallowed, the cold metal thorns reminded her that her throat was no longer her own. The mud from the thing had dried into a crust on her skin, gray and cracking like a lizard's hide. But there was no time for washing. The victory horns were sounding near the docks. The men who had turned her father's hall into a slaughterhouse were returning from a coastal raid, their hulls heavy with silver and their hands stained with the blood of her kin. Inside the great hall, the air was thick with the suffocating grease of roasting boar and the acrid smoke of peat fires. The tapestries that Astrid's mother had woven, depicting the grand voyages of their ancestors, had been torn down to wipe the blades of the new masters. In their place sat Jarl Bjorn and his huskarls, their laughter booming against the timber rafters like rolls of thunder. "The ale! Where is the traitor's vintage?" shouted Sigurd the Scarred. Sigurd was a massive man with a face divided by a jagged white line from forehead to chin, a souvenir from a battle he had nearly lost to Astrid's father. His eyes, small and predatory, tracked Astrid as she struggled to lift a heavy wooden vat of steaming brew. Astrid moved through the shadows of the hall, her movements stiff and cautious. The bitter ale ritual had begun long before the sun set. According to the twisted logic of their captors, a house that had betrayed the community could only purify its debt by providing the highest form of Viking hospitality to its enemies. But this was no act of grace. It was a methodical dismantling of the soul. By forcing Astrid to nourish the very mouths that had cursed her father, they were making her complicit in her own family's erasure. Working beside her was Helga, a woman in her late 30s with weary, sunken eyes and hands calloused by years of tending the communal fires. Helga had been a trusted servant in Astrid's household, a woman who had taught Astrid how to identify healing herbs. Now, Helga's hands shook so violently that the ale sloshed over the rim of the pitchers. "Don't look at them, child," Helga whispered, her voice barely audible over the roaring jests of the warriors. "Look at the floor. If you meet their eyes, you give them a target for their cruelty." But some targets were impossible to miss. In the center of the hall, Thyra, Astrid's little sister, was being forced to hold a heavy tray of salt cakes. Her small arms were trembling, the silver tray dipping lower with every passing minute. Standing over her was Halfdan the Cruel, a younger warrior with a thin, mocking smile and hair bleached white by sea salt. He took pleasure in nudging the tray with his foot, watching the young girl struggle to regain her balance. The subplots of the hall were a tapestry of quiet desperation. In the corner, a group of elder women, former noblewomen now reduced to scullery maids, whispered of a hidden cache of iron hidden beneath the floorboards of the old forge. They watched for a moment of weakness, their eyes reflecting the flickering firelight with a vengeful glint. Among them was Gunhild, a formidable matron with a sharp nose and silver hair braided into tight, warrior-like coils. She had lost 3 sons to Bjorn's coup, and lived now only for the hope of a whispered secret. The feast reached a fever pitch as the moon climbed high. The ale flowed like a river, but it was not the sweet, honeyed mead of the past. The brew the women had been forced to prepare was infused with bitter herbs and ash, a traitor's draught meant to symbolize the foulness of their lineage. "You there, the one with the thorns!" Sigurd bellowed, pointing his greasy finger at Helga. "Pour! I want to see the foam touch the rim." Helga stepped forward, her face a mask of stone. She lifted the pitcher, but as the reflection of the fire danced in the dark liquid, she saw the ghost of her own dignity. She remembered Astrid's mother, who had treated her like a sister. She remembered the day Jarl Erik had spared her village from a fire. The pitcher stayed tilted, but not a drop fell into Sigurd's cup. "I said pour, thrall," Sigurd hissed, the scars on his face turning a deep, angry purple. "I will brew your ale," Helga said, her voice suddenly clear and resonant, cutting through the drunken din. "I will scrub your floors until my fingernails bleed, but I will not toast to the murder of my kin." A silence fell over the hall, sharp and cold as a winter blade. Jarl Bjorn leaned forward, his silver rings clinking. He didn't shout, he smiled, a slow, terrifying expression of predatory delight. "Loyalty is a rare thing among ghosts," Bjorn said. "If you will not give the ale to us, then you shall have it all for yourself. Since you love the traitor's house so dearly, you shall drink their salt." He signaled to Halfdan, who dragged a large, salt-encrusted barrel into the center of the hall. It was the brine used for preserving fish, thick with sea salt and the dregs of the bitterest ale. "Drink," Bjorn commanded. Two huskarls seized Helga by her hair, forcing her head back. Astrid tried to rush forward, her hand reaching out for her friend, but a guard's spear butt slammed into her stomach, folding her in half. She watched, gasping for air, as they began to pour. The ritual was agonizing. Salt in such high quantities was a poison. It burned the throat and shriveled the tongue. Helga struggled, her muffled cries echoing against the wood, but they did not stop. They poured until her stomach distended, until her skin grew pale, and her eyes bulged with the pressure of the fluid. Every time she gagged, they struck her, forcing her to swallow the brine of her own humiliation. Astrid watched from the shadows, her nails digging into the palms of her hands until she drew blood. She looked at Thyra, who had buried her face in her hands, weeping silently. She looked at Gunhild, whose jaw was set in a line of iron. When the barrel was finally empty, they tossed Helga aside like a broken doll. She lay on the floor, gasping, her body convulsing as the salt began to shut down her organs from within. She was not dead, but she was broken. A living warning to anyone who thought that a thrall still possessed a will. "Continue the service," Bjorn said, returning to his seat as if nothing had happened. "The night is young, and I'm still thirsty." Astrid stood up, her legs shaking. She walked to the pitcher Helga had dropped, picked it up, and began to pour. Her face was as cold as the iron around her neck. She did not look at Sigurd. She did not look at Bjorn. She looked only at the amber liquid, realizing that if they were to survive, they would have to become as bitter and as enduring as the ale they served. The victory feast had left the great hall smelling of stale vomit and burnt fat, but the dawn offered no cleansing. Instead, the sun rose as a pale, sickly disk, casting a flat light over the frozen fjord. Helga lay in the corner of the kitchen, her breathing labored and wet, her body swollen from the salt that still ravaged her veins. She could not walk, but the new masters of Kattegat had no mercy for the broken. "Move them out!" Jarl Bjorn's voice boomed from the frost-covered wharf. "The journey to the sacred grove begins now. If the traitors cannot walk like men, they shall bleed like beasts." The women were driven from the warmth of the embers into the biting air. Astrid felt the iron thorns of her collar bite deep as a guard shoved her forward. Her boots, the sturdy leather ones her father had gifted her, were torn from her feet. Beside her, Thyra cried out as her small shoes were tossed into the sea. The sisters stood barefoot on the permafrost, the cold seeping into their bones like liquid lead. This was not merely a march. It was a ritual passage known as the Jolvalk. In the whispers of the Skalds, the path to Helheim, the realm of the dishonorable dead, required the soul to cross the river Gjöll, a torrent filled with sharp knives and jagged swords. To the Vikings, if a traitor was to be purged, their mortal body had to endure a physical manifestation of that hellish journey. The path stretching ahead toward the cliffs was not natural. During the night, The thralls under Bjorn's command had been forced to prepare the thorny path. They had crushed thousands of bleached seashells, spreading the razor-sharp shards over the frozen mud. Intertwined with the shells were snow thorns, thick, dried brambles from the blackthorn bushes, their needles hardened by the frost to the strength of iron nails. Leading the procession was a man known as Skari, the Raven Feeder. He was the Jarl's beastmaster, a gaunt man with a hunched back and a face hidden behind a mask made from a wolf's skull. He carried a heavy whip of braided walrus hide, and his eyes, visible through the bone sockets, glinted with a feverish devotion to the old, dark gods. "Walk, daughters of filth!" Skari shrieked, the wind catching his tattered black cloak. "Every drop of blood you spill is a prayer to the Norns to forget your names." Astrid took her first step. The sensation was not a sharp pain at first, but a crushing cold that made her skin feel brittle. Then the weight of her body pressed a shell shard through her heel. A hot, searing jolt raced up her spine. She gasped, her knees buckling, but she caught herself. She looked back at Thyra. The little girl was frozen, her face ghostly white, her tiny toes curling away from the jagged ground. "I can't, Astrid," Thyra whimpered, her voice lost in the roar of the surf below the cliffs. "The ground is biting me." Astrid looked at the miles of gray, thorn-strewn path ahead. She looked at the guards who were laughing as they prodded the other women with spear butts. She saw Gunhild, the silver-haired matron, stepping forward with a grim determination, her feet already weeping red onto the white frost. In that moment, a subplot of resistance began to flicker. Gunhild leaned toward Astrid as they moved. "Stay in my shadow, child." The older woman grunted through gritted teeth. "We walk in a line. The first ones crush the largest thorns. The ones behind have a smoother path. We bleed together, or we die alone." The women formed a precarious chain of suffering. The elders took the front, their calloused skin offering a few seconds of protection before the shells pierced through. Astrid watched as the path behind them turned from gray to a horrific, vivid crimson. The snow didn't melt under the blood. It drank it, turning into a slush of frozen gore. By the second hour, the cold had numbed the initial agony, replacing it with a rhythmic, throbbing torture. Astrid's feet were no longer hers. They were heavy weights of shredded meat. Every step felt like treading on hot coals. Beside her, a young girl named Eira, who had been a weaver in the village, collapsed. Her feet were a ruin of white bone and red sinew. Before Astrid could reach for her, Skari's whip cracked. "Leave her to the crows," Skari barked. "If she cannot reach the grove, hell has already claimed her." Astrid ignored the whip. She turned to Thyra, whose legs were shaking so violently she could no longer stand. The child's feet were covered in deep gashes, the frost-bitten skin turning a terrifying shade of blue. "Climb on, little bird," Astrid whispered, her voice cracking. "But Astrid, your feet, they're shaking," Thyra sobbed. "I am a daughter of the North Sea," Astrid said, putting a false steel into her eyes. "My bones are made of oars and oak. Climb on." Astrid knelt, the shells cutting into her knees, and pulled Thyra onto her back. The added weight was agonizing. The shards of shell and the blackthorn needles dived deeper into Astrid's soles, reaching for the nerves. She stood up, her vision swimming in a sea of gray and gold. Step. The sound was a sickening squelch of blood on ice. Step. A thorn snapped off inside her arch, sending a fresh wave of nausea through her. The procession moved along the cliff's edge. Below them, the North Sea thrashed against the rocks, a reminder of the sea snake's dance that surely awaited them later. But for now, there was only the path. The climax of the march came at the Ridge of Sighs, a steep incline where the wind blew so fiercely it threatened to throw them into the abyss. Here, the guards had piled the thorns thickest. Bjorn stood at the top of the ridge, watching with a goblet of mead in his hand. He wanted to see them break. He wanted to see them crawl. Astrid felt her strength failing. The weight of Thyra felt like a mountain. Her breath came in ragged, bloody gasps. She looked down at her feet. She could no longer see the flesh. There was only a thick coating of red that stained the pristine snow with every stride. The trail she left behind was a long, unbroken ribbon of scarlet, a map of her agony. "Look at the horizon, Thyra," Astrid gasped, her sweat freezing on her eyelashes. "Don't look down. Tell me about the summer gardens." The yellow flowers?" Thyra asked, her voice small against the wind. "The ones that smelled like honey?" "Yes," Astrid groaned, forcing one foot in front of the other. "Keep talking about the honey." The guards grew silent as Astrid passed. Even in their cruelty, there was a primitive respect for such endurance. Her footprints were no longer just marks in the snow. They were a testament. Every step was a defiance of the law that said she was nothing but property. She was a sister. She was a protector. As they finally reached the plateau of the sacred grove, Astrid sank to her knees. She didn't let Thyra fall. She lowered her gently onto a patch of clear moss. Astrid looked back at the path they had conquered. The white hillside was scarred by a jagged red line, a scream written in blood across the face of the earth. She had survived the Gulvalk, but as she looked at her ruined feet, she knew the journey into the heart of darkness had only just begun. The sacred grove was a place where the gods were said to breathe. But today the air felt stagnant, choked by the copper tang of blood and the damp musk of ancient moss. The women lay scattered across the clearing like broken driftwood, their shredded feet staining the earth. Astrid held Thyra close, trying to shield the child's eyes from the sight of Skari the raven feeder, who was now meticulously preparing a small stone altar at the base of a gnarled ash tree. "Silence is the only virtue left for a traitor," Skari hissed, his wolf skull mask tilting as he looked toward Jarl Bjorn. The fear among the warriors was palpable, a stark contrast to their usual bravado. They stood in a wide circle, clutching their amulets and gripping their spear shafts until their knuckles turned white. They were not afraid of a woman's blade. They were terrified of her tongue. In the north, the cider, the ancient magic of weavers and prophetesses, was a force that could unravel the very threads of fate. It was believed that a woman's curse, uttered in the throes of ultimate suffering, could rot a warrior's shield from within, blunt his axe in the heat of battle, and ensure his soul was denied entrance to Valhalla. To the Vikings, a curse was not just a wish, it was a physical weapon, and Astrid's eyes, burning with a cold blue fire, looked capable of summoning a storm that could drown them all. Bjorn signaled to a new figure emerging from the trees. This was Runa the Seeress, a woman whose face was a map of deep, ritualistic scars and whose eyes had been clouded by cataracts, making them appear like two milky orbs of bone. She carried a basket woven from human hair, filled with long, needle-sharp slivers of bone and thin, sinewy cords of dried mistletoe root. Mistletoe was the plant that had killed the god Balder. It was the sacred bane, the only wood that could bind a soul. "The words of the fallen must be sealed," Runa croaked, her voice sounding like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone, "lest they poison the wind and bring the Draugr to our gates." The ritual of the silent vow began with the elders. Gunhild was the first to be dragged forward. The matron did not struggle. She looked at Astrid and gave a slow, deliberate nod, a silent command to endure. Two huskarls pinned Gunhild's head against the altar. Runa leaned over her, the bone needle glinting. The mistletoe cord was soaked in a bitter, numbing lye made from ash, but it was not enough to kill the pain. Astrid watched in horror as the needle pierced Gunhild's lips, weaving the dark root through the flesh. Gunhild's muffled groans were strangled in her throat, a sound of agony that vibrated through the very ground Astrid sat upon. The older woman's hands clawed at the dirt, but she did not beg. When it was finished, her mouth was a jagged line of black cord and swelling skin. A subplot of despair began to take hold among the younger women. Era, the weaver whose feet had been ruined on the thorny path, began to laugh hysterically, a sound of a mind finally snapping under the weight of the dark gods. She began to chant an old nursery rhyme, her voice rising in a shrill, haunting pitch until a guard struck her across the face. The warriors flinched. They feared even her song was a vessel for a hex. "The girl!" Bjorn pointed at Thyra. "No!" Astrid screamed, her voice echoing off the cliffs. She tried to stand, but her ruined soles collapsed beneath her. She dragged herself forward, her fingernails tearing into the moss. "Take me first. She is a child. She has no magic. She has no curses." Runa the seeress turned her milky eyes toward Astrid. "The blood of a Jarl is potent, child, or not. But the elder sister, her spirit is a thorn in the side of the All-Father. She shall go next." Astrid was seized. The iron collar around her neck was used as a handle to jerk her head back. She felt the rough bark of the ash tree against her skull. Skari held her jaw with a hand that smelled of old carrion. Astrid did not close her eyes. She did not blink. She stared directly into Skari's bone mask, peering through the eye sockets to find the man beneath. As Runa approached with the mistletoe threaded needle, a sudden silence fell over the grove. The wind stopped. Even the crows ceased their squawking. The first puncture was a cold, sharp intrusion. Astrid felt the needle slide through her upper lip. She didn't scream. She used the pain to fuel her hatred, focusing every ounce of her will into a mental incantation of vengeance. Runa pulled the cord, taut. Astrid felt the rough texture of the mistletoe root rasping against her nerves. The second stitch, the third. The climax of the ritual was not the physical act, but the battle of wills. Skari, who had presided over 100 sacrifices, found himself unable to maintain his grip. He looked into Astrid's eyes, wide, unyielding, and overflowing with a lethal contempt. He saw not a victim, but a vengeful spirit already haunting his footsteps. The hand holding her jaw began to tremble. His breath became shallow, rattling against the inside of his wolf mask. "Finish it!" Bjorn barked, sensing his beast master's hesitation. Runa's bone needle moved with trembling fingers. She sensed the power Astrid was radiating, a defiance that law and ritual could not bind. As the final knot was tied, sealing Astrid's lips into a permanent, bloody silence, Astrid let out a long, low hum from deep within her chest. It was a sound of mourning, of power, and of a promise. Skari recoiled, stumbling back and nearly tripping over the altar. He scrambled to regain his footing, his mask lopsided. To the warriors watching, it appeared as though the Jarl's executioner had been struck by an invisible blow. A murmur of fear rippled through the ranks. They looked at Astrid, her face smeared with blood and black cord, and they saw a living curse. Astrid was pushed back to the dirt. She crawled to Thyra, who was paralyzed with terror. Astrid couldn't speak comfort, but she pulled the girl's head into her lap, stroking her hair with hands that were steady as stone. She looked at the men who had done this, and though her mouth was sewn shut, her eyes told them everything. "You have silenced my voice, but you have awakened my soul, and my soul will see you burn." The sacred grove fell behind them, a silent witness to their mutilated faces. The women were marched or dragged back toward the fjords where the dragon-headed longships swayed like tethered predators on the black water. For Astrid, the world had become a symphony of muffled pulses. Every breath she took through her nose was a struggle. The mistletoe stitches across her lips had begun to throb with a rhythmic heat, the flesh tightening as the dried roots drank the moisture of her wounds. The salt air hit them first, sharp and unforgiving. To the Northmen, the sea was the domain of Erasure, the brewer of the gods, whose brewing vats were the depths of the ocean. To be cast into the waves was not merely to drown, it was to be judged by the primal weight of the world. Jarl Bjorn stood on the prow of the Iron Serpent, his primary warship. He looked down at the group of women, his expression one of bored cruelty. "The earth has refused to swallow your shame," Bjorn declared, his voice carrying over the crashing surf. "Now we see if the waves can wash the rot from your blood. You shall dance for Aegir." The sea snake's dance was a punishment reserved for those whose presence was deemed a spiritual blight upon the land. The women were forced onto the man, the narrow catwalks running along the sides of the longship. One by one, their wrists were bound with coarse hemp ropes, and they were lowered over the side. They were not submerged completely, but suspended, so that their lower bodies dangled in the churning, ice-cold water, while the ship prepared to sail. Astrid felt the shock of the water like 1,000 needles. The North Sea in winter was a liquid tomb. Beside her, hung by the same thick rope, was a new face. Brynhild. She was a shield maiden of the Outer Isles, a woman of powerful build with arms covered in faded blue tattoos of serpents. Her jaw was square and defiant, though her lips, too, had been sewn shut by Runa the Seeress. Brynhild kicked against the hull of the ship, her eyes burning with a warrior's fury that even the cold could not extinguish. As the Iron Serpent moved out of the sheltered bay and into the open sea, the dance began. The movement of the ship caused the women to swing violently. Every wave that crashed against the hull engulfed them in salt spray. The brine burned the open wounds on their feet and stung the stitches on their faces. But the cold was only the first predator. "Look!" Thyra's muffled whimper vibrated through the rope. Astrid followed her sister's terrified gaze. In the dark water beneath them, pale, ghostly shapes began to undulate. They were the sea snakes, hundreds of stinging jellyfish with translucent bells and long, trailing tentacles that glowed with a faint, sickly phosphorescence. The movement of the ship's oars stirred them into a frenzy. As the women swung, their bare legs brushed against the stinging threads. The pain was electric. It was a searing, venomous fire that bypassed the skin and struck the nerves directly. Astrid felt her muscles seize, her legs cramping in the freezing water as the toxins began to spread. She saw Brynhild's eyes go wide, her body jerking as several tentacles wrapped around her thighs. There was no way to scream. The mistletoe cords held their mouths in a gruesome, bloody seal. A subplot of hidden mercy unfolded on the deck above. A young thrall boy named Cole, barely 15 and tasked with tending the ropes, moved with feigned clumsiness. He was a boy with a soft face and wide, frightened eyes, a captive from a previous raid who had not yet lost his heart. As he adjusted the tension of the ropes, he leaned over the edge, pretending to check the knots while actually loosening the hemp, just enough so the women could grip the wood of the hull with their fingernails. It was a small mercy, but it gave them a sliver of leverage against the relentless swaying. The sky began to bruise, turning a deep violet black as a squall rolled in from the horizon. The waves grew larger, turning into towering walls of obsidian that threatened to crush the suspended women against the oak planks of the ship. The warriors on deck began to chant, a low guttural song to Aegir, asking for safe passage through the storm. They ignored the Ran Bien, the sea snakes, clinging to the women below. Astrid felt the darkness closing in. The hypothermia was reaching for her heart, whispering that it would be so much easier to simply let go, to slip into the blackness and find her father in the halls of the dead. She felt Thyra's hand slip. The child was losing consciousness, her fingers turning white as she struggled to hold the rope. In the midst of the roaring wind and the stinging spray, Astrid closed her eyes. She couldn't speak, but she began to hum. It was a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through her chest, through the hemp rope, and reached Brynhild. Brynhild took up the vibration, then Gunhild, then the others. They did not sing with words. They sang with their spirits, a thought song, Hat Bang Tam Tung. It was a melody of ancient hearth fires, of the scent of pine needles, and the warmth of a mother's touch. It was a song of life that refused to be extinguished by the salt. Through the ropes that bound them, they reached out and grasped each other's hands. This human chain became their anchor. As the storm reached its peak, the iron serpent tilted precariously. The women were slammed into the hull, their skin abraded by the barnacles, their legs burning from the jellyfish stings. But they did not let go. Astrid gripped Thyra's wrist with a strength that transcended bone and muscle. She felt the pulse of the other women through the line, a collective heartbeat that defied the fury of the storm. On deck, Skari the Ravenfeeder peered over the edge, his wolf mask slick with rain. He expected to see corpses. Instead, he saw a line of women, their eyes open and glowing with a terrifying, unified light, their hands interlocked like the roots of the great ash tree. The humming sound rose above the gale, a ghostly chorus that made the warriors cross their arms and look at the sea with newfound dread. "They are not dying," Skari whispered to Bjorn. "The sea is not taking them. It is carrying them." Bjorn gripped the railing, his knuckles white. The sea snake's dance was supposed to be a journey to Helheim, but as the ship crested a massive wave, the women held firm. They had turned a ritual of execution into a ritual of endurance. Astrid looked up through the spray, her bloodied lips still sealed, but her spirit screaming a song of survival that the waves could not drown. The iron serpent finally groaned against the wooden pilings of a secluded cove, far from the prying eyes of neutral clans. The sea snake's dance had ended, leaving the women as salt-crusted apparitions, their skin pale and puckered from the brine. As they were dragged onto the jagged shingle, the humming, that haunting mental song, faded into a heavy, suffocating silence. Astrid's legs, once powerful and steady, were now trembling stalks of flesh, covered in the angry red welts of jellyfish stings that burned like liquid fire whenever the wind touched them. The destination was a natural amphitheater of dark basalt, where the earth seemed to have been torn open by the hands of giants. In the center stood a row of wooden frames shaped like the spread wings of a bird. This was the place of the shadow eagle. To the Vikings, the blood eagle was a ritual for kings and great warriors, a sacrifice to Odin that required the ribs to be hacked from the spine. But for those labeled as Nithing, those stripped of all honor, deemed lower than the dirt beneath a boot, there was a more protracted, agonizing version. The shadow eagle did not seek to kill quickly. It sought to transform the victim into a living monument of shame, a bird that could never fly, forced to endure the weight of its own flayed skin. As the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, a new figure stepped into the firelight. This was Kjell the Flayer, the Jarl's master of punishments. He was a small, wiry man with fingers that moved with the terrifying precision of a seamstress. He wore an apron of stained leather and carried a roll of knives so thin they vibrated in the breeze. Unlike the roaring warriors, Kjell was silent, his eyes reflecting a clinical, detached curiosity about the limits of human endurance. "The Nithing has no spine for the true eagle," Kjell murmured, his voice a thin whistle. "So we shall give them wings of salt and shadow." A subplot of internal conflict emerged among the younger Huskarls. Eric Youngblood, a warrior barely 18 summers old with a face still soft from youth, lowered his gaze as the frames were prepared. He had been the one to carry the salt sacks, and the weight seemed to bow his shoulders. He remembered Astrid's father teaching him how to hold a shield. The brutality was beginning to fracture the unity of the younger men, who whispered of the Norns and the terrible price of such cruelty. "Face the wood," Skari the raven feeder barked, his wolf mask now splattered with dried sea salt. Astrid was the first. Her iron collar was chained to the top of the frame, forcing her to stand on her tiptoes, her ruined feet barely touching the cold stone. Her back was bared to the biting wind. She could feel the presence of the other women behind her, Brynhild, Gunhild, and the weeping Thyra, all being bound to their own wooden crosses. Kiel approached Astrid. He didn't use an axe. He used a small curved blade. With agonizing slowness, he traced 2 long vertical lines along her shoulder blades. The cold air rushed into the incisions, a sensation so sharp it felt like ice being driven into her lungs. Then, with the skill of a man peeling fruit, he began to separate the skin from the muscle, pulling it outward to create the wings. The pain was a white-hot explosion that threatened to shatter Astrid's mind. But she could not scream. The mistletoe stitches across her lips held firm, turning her agony into a frantic, internal vibration. She felt the warmth of her own blood flowing down her waist, a stark contrast to the freezing night. "The salt," Bjorn commanded, leaning forward in his high stone seat. Kjell reached into the sacks Eric had brought. He took handfuls of coarse, gray sea salt and rubbed them directly into the exposed muscle of the wings. The climax of the ritual was designed to be a grand spectacle of sound. As the salt hit the wounds, the tribal drums began to beat. These were the great thunder drums, massive frames of elk hide struck by heavy mallets. Boom, boom, boom. The rhythm was relentless, timed to match the frantic thudding of a dying heart. The intent was clear, to drown out the screams of the victims, to ensure that their suffering was private, while their humiliation was public. Behind Astrid, Brynhild began to thrash against her bonds. The shield maiden's strength was being used against her. Every movement made the wings on her back tear further. The drums grew louder, a wall of sound that vibrated the very stones of the amphitheater. Astrid felt her consciousness slipping. The drum beats were no longer outside of her. They were inside her skull, crushing her thoughts. She looked at the ground, seeing the shadow of the wooden frame cast by the firelight. It looked like a monstrous, distorted bird, the shadow eagle. But then, through the thundering noise, she felt it again, a phantom touch. Because their lips were sewn and their voices silenced by the drums, the women found a new way to scream. They leaned their foreheads against the wooden frames. The wood, a living thing of grain and fiber, carried the vibrations of their agony from one frame to the next. Astrid felt Brynhild's pain through the timber. She felt Gunhild's stoic endurance. She felt Thera's pure, unadulterated terror. The pain didn't vanish, but it shifted. It flowed. By connecting through the wood, they shared the burden of the salt and the knife. The wings on their backs were no longer marks of shame. They became a bridge. Astrid took a deep, shuddering breath through her nose. She stopped fighting the drums. She let the rhythm carry her. She turned her head slightly, catching the eye of Kjell the Flayer. The man was leaning in to check his work, expecting to find a broken, sobbing mess. Instead, he found a woman whose eyes were wide and lucid, glowing with a terrifying, shared strength. Astrid didn't look like a Nithing. She looked like a Valkyrie carved from the very basalt of the cove. Kjell flinched, his knife slipping and nicking his own finger. He looked at the other women and saw the same thing, a collective, silent defiance that the drums could not drown out. The warriors in the circle began to step back, their hands shaking as they gripped their charms. They had sought to make these women nameless, honorless ghosts. Instead, they had forged something far more dangerous, a sisterhood of shadows, bound by a pain so deep it had become a weapon. As the fires began to die down, The women remained hanging on their frames, their wings stiffening in the frost. The drums finally ceased, leaving a ringing silence that felt heavier than the noise. Bjorn walked away, his footsteps hurried, refusing to look back at the row of shadow eagles. He had won the battle of the flesh, but as the first snow of winter began to fall, dusting the wings in white, he knew he was losing the war for their souls. The dawn that followed the night of the shadow eagle was not gold, but a bruised, suffocating gray. The women were cut down from their wooden frames, their flayed backs now stiffened with a mixture of dried blood, salt, and frost. They could no longer stand upright. The skin of their backs had tightened like parchment, forcing them to hunch forward like broken scavenger birds. Astrid's lips remained a jagged line of mistletoe cord, her face a mask of swollen endurance. She crawled to Thera, whose small wings were a horrific sight against her pale skin, and pulled the child close to her chest. They were not returned to the longhouses. To the Vikings, the flaying of the shadow eagle was the final step of their physical existence. What remained was the erasure of their spiritual lineage. Jarl Bjorn stood at the edge of the settlement, near the communal refuse pit, a place where the village dumped everything the earth had rejected. Rotting fish offal, the carcasses of diseased livestock, and the broken shards of useless tools. The North does not remember the weak, Bjorn declared, his voice lacking its former triumph, replaced by a strange, hollow urgency. You are no longer of the clans. You are not even thralls. You are the waste of the world, and to the waste you shall return. In Norse belief, the sanctity of burial was everything. To be laid in a ship or a stone-lined grave was to ensure the soul's journey to the halls of the ancestors. To be cast into the filth was to be condemned as Nid, a nameless entity whose soul would be denied by both Odin and Hel, forced to wander the mist-shrouded between worlds for eternity. A new figure emerged from the shadows of the tanning pits. This was Thorgil the Mute, the village pit warden. He was a massive man with shoulders as broad as a draft horse, but his face was a ruin of burn scars, and his tongue had been cut out years ago for an unknown crime. He moved with a heavy, rhythmic limp, carrying a long iron hook used for dragging dead horses. Thorgil did not look at the women with cruelty. He looked at them with the vacant, terrifying indifference of a man who had spent his life among the dead. Thorgil began the work. With his iron hook, he snagged the chains of their iron collars and dragged them toward the lip of the pit. One by one, the women were pushed into the darkness. Astrid fell into a soft, sickening slurry of rot. The stench was a physical blow, the cloying sweetness of decaying flesh mixed with a sharp, acidic tang of animal bile. As she struggled to sit up, she felt the cold, wet touch of a horse's ribs beneath her hands. Beside her, Brynhild let out a muffled, choked sound through her sewn lips, her fingers clutching at a heap of sodden furs that had once belonged to a plague victim. They were buried in the belly of the earth's rejection. Above them, the village children, led by the elders who sought to harden their hearts, threw baskets of ash and kitchen scraps down onto their heads. A subplot of silent observation occurred at the pit's edge. Eric Youngblood stood apart from the other warriors, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, but his eyes were fixed on the pit. Beside him stood a woman named Solveig, the village herbalist. She was a middle-aged woman with a sharp mind and a quiet, observant nature. She had seen too many purifications in her time, and she saw the way the younger warriors were beginning to flinch. "You see them as filth, boy," Solveig whispered, her voice barely a breath. "But the earth is a strange mother. Sometimes she hides her greatest treasures in the places we refuse to look. Watch the Jarl. He fears the dead more than the living." Inside the pit, the darkness was absolute. The cold muck seeped into the wounds on Astrid's back, the salt reacting with the filth to create a stinging, pulsating agony. Thyra was shivering uncontrollably, her head resting on Astrid's shoulder. The women were huddled together in a circle, their shared warmth the only thing keeping the frost from claiming their hearts. Astrid felt a strange weight in the hem of her inner tunic, a small hard lump she had forgotten. In the chaos of being stripped of her raven feather cloak, she had managed to keep this one piece of her old life. She reached into the tattered fabric with numb fingers and pulled out a single dried seed. It was a seed from the great ash tree that had stood in her father's courtyard, the tree they called the Little Yggdrasil. Her father had given it to her on her naming day, telling her that as long as the seed existed, the family's roots would never truly die. The climax of their descent into oblivion was not a scream, but an act of quiet, defiant hope. Astrid looked at the seed in her palm. In this pit of death, surrounded by the discarded remains of the world, she saw the truth that Bjorn could not understand. Death was not the end. It was the compost for the future. She reached down into the black, stinking mud, the Vungbongen of her prison. With her fingers, she cleared away a patch of rotting straw until she reached the actual soil beneath the filth. Her back screamed in protest as she bent over, the wings of her flayed skin stretching painfully. She pressed the seed into the dark earth. As she did, the humming began again, but this time it was different. It wasn't a song of mourning or a song of endurance. It was a song of growth. Brynhild heard it. Gunhild heard it. They leaned their foreheads together in the dark, their hands joining over the spot where the seed lay buried. Above them, the sky began to dump a heavy, wet snow, threatening to seal the pit. The warriors walked away, convinced they had erased the line of Jarl Erik. They believed they had turned these women into waste. But beneath the layers of rot and ash, Astrid felt a strange, humming warmth emanating from the ground. She realized then that they weren't being buried to be forgotten. They were being planted. Astrid pulled a handful of the black muck over the seed, patting it down with a tenderness that defied the horror of her surroundings. She looked up at the circle of gray sky far above. Her lips were still sealed with mistletoe. Her back was a ruin of salt and shadow, and she was surrounded by the stench of the dead. But as she laid her hand over Thyra's heart, she felt a pulse that was as steady as the turning of the seasons. "We are the seeds," she thought, the words echoing in the silence of her mind. "And the earth knows our names." The weight of the world had settled into the refuse pit, a thick blanket of snow sealing the women beneath a tomb of white silence. Inside the darkness, the air was thin and tasted of frost, but the warmth Astrid had felt from the buried seed began to spread, a phantom heat that pulsed against her palms. She held Thyra's shivering frame, her own body a map of flayed skin and salt scars. Yet she did not feel like a victim. She felt like the deep roots of the earth, waiting for the crack of spring. Above the pit, the silence was shattered not by the wind, but by the brazen roar of a war horn. It was not the rhythmic, predatory blast of Jarl Bjorn's hunters. This was a deeper, resonant sound. The horn of Vali, a call used by the northern mountain clans who had once sworn blood oaths to Astrid's father. Through the narrow gaps in the snow-covered refuse, Astrid heard the clash of iron. The village of Kattegat, which had watched their suffering with idle cruelty, was suddenly a chaotic storm of fire and steel. Leading the charge was Leif the Iron-Handed. He was a veteran warrior of 60 winters, his left arm encased in a sleeve of reinforced mail to compensate for an old, shield-shattering injury. He had been a brother-in-arms to Jarl Erik, and his eyes, as gray as the mountain mist, burned with the shame of arriving too late to save his friend, but with the fire to save what remained. "By the Norns," Leif's voice thundered above the pit. "Bjorn has turned this hall into a slaughterhouse. Search the pits. If a single drop of Erik's blood remains on this earth, find it. A subplot of internal reckoning reached its boiling point at the edge of the pit. Eric Youngblood, the warrior who had flinched during the flaying, stood his ground against Jarl Bjorn. As Bjorn tried to flee toward the docks, Eric blocked his path, his sword drawn. "You called them nothing," Eric spat, his voice trembling not with fear, but with a newfound clarity. "But you are the one who has brought the Draugr to our gates. You are the rot in the roots of this clan." The coup was swift. The younger Huskarls, weary of the ritualized cruelty that had stained their honor, laid down their arms or turned them against Skari the Raven Feeder and his acolytes. Bjorn was chained in the very iron collars he had forged for the women, forced to kneel in the mud of the Thing. The light of the Norns, the weavers of destiny, seemed to break through the clouds just as Thorgil the Mute and Leif's men reached the refuse pit. They didn't use hooks this time. They lowered ladders made of sturdy hemp and oak. When Leif descended into the filth and saw the women, their mouths sewn with mistletoe, their backs flayed into wings of shadow, he fell to his knees in the muck and wept. "Forgive us," Leif whispered, his iron-covered hand shaking as he reached for Astrid. Astrid allowed herself to be carried out. As she emerged from the darkness, the cold air felt like a benediction rather than a curse. The villagers stood in a wide circle, their heads bowed in a heavy, suffocating shame. They expected a bloodbath. They expected Astrid to seize a blade and demand the heads of those who had pelted her with stones. The climax of the story unfolded not with a sword, but with a pair of shears. Solveig the herbalist stepped forward, her hands steady as she worked. With the precision of one who knows that healing is a form of battle, she cut the mistletoe cords that had sealed Astrid's lips for weeks. As the final thread was pulled away, Astrid did not scream. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her first taste of unfiltered air. Then Leif offered her his own seax, a heavy, razor-sharp fighting knife. He pointed toward Bjorn, who was whimpering in the dirt. "Take his life, Astrid. The law of the North demands blood for blood." Astrid looked at the knife, then at the man who had destroyed her family. She looked at the children who had thrown stones and the women who had turned their backs. She felt the scars on her back tighten, the wings that would never let her stand perfectly straight again. She took the knife, but she did not walk toward Bjorn. Instead, she walked to the center of the Thing, where the law speaker stood trembling. She drove the knife deep into the wooden pillar of the assembly, the sacred post of the laws. "I will not drink from the cup of vengeance." Astrid's voice was raspy, sounding like the wind through the pines, but it carried to every ear in the settlement. "If I kill him, I remain in the pit. If I kill him, the shadow eagle never stops flying." She turned to the tribe, her eyes vivid and terrifyingly wise. She began to tell them of the sea snake's dance. She told them of the humming song in the storm and the way the wooden frames had carried their shared agony. She told them about the seed in the dark. "You sought to erase us," she said, pointing to the flayed women standing behind her, Brynhild, Gunhild, and little Thera. "But you only showed us who we truly are. We are the ones who endure. From this day, the Gragas shall be rewritten. A house is not judged by the strength of its jarl's axe, but by the honor he shows to the voiceless. If you want a queen, you must first learn to be humans." A subplot of cultural transformation began as Gunhild and the elder women stepped forward, taking the iron collars from the guards and tossing them into the forge fire. The era of the shadow was over. The women were no longer property. They were the architects of a new Kattegat. Months passed. The snow melted, revealing a land that had been scrubbed clean by the winter. Astrid stood on the highest cliff overlooking the fjord, the very place where traitors were once cast to their deaths. She was dressed in a simple tunic of undyed wool, her hair braided with the same raven feathers she had once lost. Beside her, Thyra pointed down toward the old refuse pit. It was no longer a place of filth. The village had worked for weeks to clear the rot, turning it into a garden of remembrance. In the center of that garden, a vibrant emerald green shoot had pierced through the black earth. The seed of the great ash had taken hold, its leaves unfurling to drink the spring sun. Astrid looked out toward the horizon. The North Sea was blue and calm, a vast mirror for the sky. She felt the wings on her back, the scars that she now wore as a mantle of pride. She had not been broken, she had been forged. As the light of the morning sun touched her face, she knew that while history might try to forget the suffering of the nameless, the earth would always remember the strength of those who grew in the dark. The story of Astrid and her sisters is more than a chronicle of ancient cruelty. It is a mirror reflecting our own capacity to endure. In our daily lives, we may not face iron collars or flayed wings, but we all encounter moments where the world tries to silence us, label us, or bury our potential under the weight of failure and judgment. The moral of their journey is this: you are not what happens to you. You are the seed that decides to grow despite the soil. When you face injustice or hardship, you have a choice. You can let the salt of bitterness consume you, or you can use your struggle to forge a spirit that even your enemies must respect. True power does not come from the sword of revenge, but from the courage to stand tall, tell your truth, and break the cycle of pain for those who come after you. History is written by the victors, but the truth belongs to those who remember. If this story touched your heart and reminded you of the strength within, please like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear a message of resilience today. Comment below with your thoughts. Which part of Astrid's journey resonated with you most? And if you want to ensure the voices of the forgotten are never silenced again, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to join the Crown and Dagger family. As we close this chapter, let us take a moment of peace. May the Creator of all life bless you with a heart as resilient as the great ash. May you find light in your darkest pits and the strength to turn your scars into wings of wisdom. May your home be a sanctuary of honor, and may you always walk with the grace of those who have survived the storm. If you believe that hope can bloom in any shadow, and if you stand with the spirit of the resilient, please write Amen in the comments below. Until next time, remember the truth and stay strong.